morning. I hope that you're keeping well and finding peace during this time of isolation. The message this morning is one of good news. The text is taken from the Gospel of John, the 11th chapter. Read along, if you will, with me, if you have it in front of you. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God could be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then, after this, he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going to go there again? And Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anybody walks in the day, he does not stumble, but because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to waken him. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant he was taking rest and sleep. So Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus has already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha had learned that Jesus was coming, she went and she met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would have not died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. So Jesus said to her, Your brother will live again. Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here, and he's calling for you. And when they heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet came into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him? But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it, and Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on the account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. In times like this, we really do need some good news. And if there was ever a story of good news, it's this one. But the story doesn't start that way. Instead of good news, it starts with a pile of frustration, despair, sadness, busted expectations. It starts with hopelessness. We're told that Jesus' dear friend Lazarus was sick and dying. Mary, his sister, a woman who loved Jesus very much, sent word to Jesus. She doesn't say what she expects from him, but it's pretty clear. They've been close. He's stayed in their house. They're trusted friends. One source tells us that when Jesus was there in the home with Lazarus, he would spend long hours on the roof talking with him. There doesn't seem to be much of a need to tell Jesus what he's supposed to do. He's expected to come to the house. And you and I can understand that because we know that friends show up in times of distress. But there's more. Jesus had been healing people everywhere he went. Mary and Martha, his sister, have seen the miracles he performed. He has reached out to people who others people scorn and avoided treating, but he's treated them with love, healing their sicknesses. He's restored their broken souls. And somewhere along the way, these two sisters have become Jesus followers. And now they need him. Not only they're expecting that he'll come to the house, but they're expecting a healing. After all, if he's shown compassion to a Samaritan and blind men and beggars and provided food for people he doesn't even know, they figure surely he's going to heal Lazarus. They were his followers and his friends. And this was an emergency, a crisis. But as we read the passage, we're surprised. Maybe we're even a little shocked at what happens. The way Jesus responds. Because instead of immediately dropping what he's doing and hustling over to their house, he brushes aside their expectations and hopes with a strange prophecy. Lazarus is going to rise. Like he had done with the blind man, he focuses not on the sickness, but on the opportunity it presents. When Jesus got the message, he says, this sickness is not fatal. It's going to become an occasion to show God's glory by glorifying God's Son. So, okay, well enough. God's going to use the illness. You know, it seems like all of that may be well and good, but the words, given the sense of urgency and fears, seem somewhat dismissive, maybe even cold. Jesus seems unaware, or worse yet, unconcerned about what they're going through. Where is the expression of sympathy we would expect? Where is the compassion for these dear friends and their close followers? Perhaps that's why in the 5th chapter of John, John needs to tell us Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But then, as quickly as John reassures us, he increases the tension when he adds, so he stayed 2 more days. That contrast really seems strange, confusing. Jesus loves Lazarus, so he stays? I mean, waiting to act in a situation like this seems to be the farthest thing from love. If Jesus loves him, why doesn't he go to him immediately? Why in the world would he choose to stay where he is for 2 days and leave them stranded and alone and hurting? We're not alone in the question, because when Mary, or rather Martha is the sister of Mary and of Lazarus, when she hears that he's finally on his way, she goes out to meet him. And as we read the passage, it's easy to see someone who is disappointed and angry. At the least, what she says shows her hurt and confusion. If you would have come, she tells him, my brother wouldn't have died. In saying this, we have to understand. She's like us. She has her plans. But Jesus didn't show up when he was supposed to. He's let them down. I wonder, do you ever feel that way? It's easy to think that because something doesn't happen when and in the way that we think it should, that God has let us down. But waiting isn't abandonment. And God is not on our time schedule. His plans often have their own kind of rhythm, maybe even mostly when they seem confusing. The fact that we don't have what we want when we want it, that our expectations remain unmet, doesn't mean that God is absent. It only means that He's not using our calendar. It's one of the hardest disciplines for the follower of Jesus to learn, but it is so important that we learn it. Because it goes to the question of who is in control. Is it us or is it God? When we expect God to meet our schedule and plan, in essence, we're making us God. He becomes our servant. We become the Lord. It also raises the question of what kind of God we truly believe in. Do we believe in God the Father who, because He's wiser and more loving than we are, can withhold the good so that He can give us the best? Or protect us from the bad when we think what we want is really good? Or do we believe in a God who does our bidding because we've somehow put enough chips in the bank and we've pleased Him, and now He's paying us back for by doing us favors? Those kinds of questions, of course, who's in control and who God is, they're the ones that every Christian has to face. And we just don't face them once. In fact, each time a crisis comes, big or small, it provides a time of decision. Will we trust God when we can't see Him at work? Martha is disappointed, perhaps even hurt, maybe even miffed at Jesus. But she isn't faithless. She goes on to tell Jesus, "Even now I know that whatever you ask, God will give you." Whatever you ask, God will give you? See, that's really faith. But even still, the whatever in that of hers, and the whatever Jesus has in mind, goes beyond her imagination. Your brother will be raised up, He says. And so once again, she gathers up her faith, at least the faith in her mind, the doctrine she's learned, and says, I know that He will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. But she really has missed the point, because she's missed the main ingredient. Jesus isn't holding court on the end times. He's not going to give a lecture or a theological point to push away the pain that she's in. He's not deflecting her need onto some future event like some folks we meet who tell grieving parents that they'll be reunited with their child someday. Now hold on, Martha. By and by it'll be okay. Just try to get by for now. Instead, He tells her, I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, what you need to know is that all you need is right here. It's me. It's me, Martha. Remember when He said that the glory of God would be known through Lazarus' illness and death? It's at this point that we begin to catch the first glimpse of that glory, as Jesus begins to reveal that He is the Messiah, the Savior of the world, who's come to defeat death itself. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live, He says. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. You see, in telling her that, Jesus is telling her, what's happening here is bigger than your love for me. It's bigger than our potential loss and the funeral. It's bigger than Lazarus. It's bigger than your need. It's bigger than this moment. What's happening here is God is showing up in the world to defeat death itself. It's a powerful, incredible truth. It's world and life-changing. What He's saying is that God is in control of life and death, of history, both the world and ours. What He's saying is that He is the ruler of the universe, and that our experiences, no matter how big they seem to be, how they seem to be in the light of, in our light, are small in the light of what God is doing in eternity. But Jesus doesn't stop there. The truth of a revealed knowledge, no matter how deep or profound, it's not by itself going to satisfy her or us. The glory of God is not found in truth alone. And so Jesus, after He finishes addressing Martha, goes to meet Mary. What's interesting is that Mary meets him with exactly the same words that show the same path, and show the same path and the same disappointment and the same perhaps anger that her sister had shown. When she comes to him, she falls on his feet and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." What we need to see is that even though the question is the same, the answer is entirely different. This time, rather than truth, Jesus responds with tears. The scripture says that when he saw her, he was deeply moved, and he began to cry. Not just a tear trickling down his cheek. The word here means to gush tears, deep sobbing, red face, the kind of crying that goes down to your toes and leaves you sore and exhausted. Jesus wept. Now, it doesn't take us long, as touched as we are by Jesus' sadness, to wonder why he might cry. Hasn't he already told his disciples that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Hasn't he just come from reminding Martha of his power over death and life and the reality of the resurrection? We might even imagine what we would do if we were in Jesus' sandals. Okay, guys, enough of the blubbering, enough of your fear, enough of your weakness and that lack of faith. Step aside and just watch as I show you just who I am and how wimpy your so-called believing is. Hard to imagine you even ever doubted me. After all I've done, what's wrong with you people? Yeah, some of us might say that. Some folks might approach it in that way. But not Jesus. He weeps. He sobs. And we wonder why. I think the answer is found in what he told those disciples he was going to do. Remember that? This sickness is not fatal, but it's there to glorify God by glorifying his Son. That's what he told them. In other words, God's got bigger plans than Lazarus, bigger plans than Martha, bigger than Mary. He is going to reveal something. It is going to be glorious, and it is about God's glory. And as Jesus weeps, he does just that. He shows us a God not just of truth, but of tears. As Jesus weeps, he shows us the deep compassion that he has for Martha and Mary and Lazarus. He shows us that God hears and sees and grieves with us. In fact, he even says, "Lord, I thank you that you hear us." This Messiah is one that the prophets spoke of, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It's one of those times when we see what John means when he starts his gospel by talking about how God became flesh and how he dwelt among us in the person of Jesus. At the beginning of his book, he talks about Jesus coming and says, "We beheld his glory, full of grace," you might say those are those tears, "and truth." And John gets that all the majesty and the power of God is shown to us in the full humanity of Jesus as he weeps with us and for us. Notice I said not only with us, but for us. Because death was never God's intention. The world was created without it. It's the result of the rebellion of humans and the creation against the plan of God to give it life. Jesus himself said that the reason he came was to bring an end to this story of death. And he tells us that he himself is the source of life. And so he weeps. He weeps for Lazarus, for Mary, for Martha. He weeps for each little child or senior caught in the clutches and being dragged down by illness and sickness and death. He weeps for each family grieving. He weeps for humanity, and he weeps for you and me, for our loss and for our belief in the midst of it all. God, through one who is acquainted with sorrow, grieves for us. He yearns for us to believe that he will overcome, for us to know that the victory before we even see it. And so our story tells us that Jesus gets up to go to the tomb. He will raise Lazarus there. He will pull him from the grave. He will call out to him, Lazarus, come forth, and Lazarus will respond as the resurrection and the life speaks to him. He will be raised. But as wonderful as that is, it's not the point of the story. Just before he calls out to Lazarus, Jesus refocuses their attention away from Lazarus and onto the bigger one. Once again, he says, didn't I tell you? If you believed, you will see the glory of God. The point. To see God through believing. That's the point of the Lazarus story. That's the point of the whole event. To see through believing that he is in control. That he is a God of truth. To see through believing that he weeps. That he is a God of tears. In this story of raising, God is showing us who he is by showing us his Son. And he's showing us the power of faith. During those times of crisis, you see, we need both truth and grace. Truth and tears. As we approach the ravages of the coronavirus, we need to lean into this God of truth. We can turn away from cheap answers then, including blame and deceit, rumors. And we can affirm the truth that God is still on his throne despite human weakness and nature's ravages. It's true that we don't know his plans or purposes. We don't understand lots of things. But by faith, we can affirm the truth that the greatest evils can be used to reveal God's glory and that he has plans and purposes beyond our imagination. We can trust that truth. We can trust it to find peace and strength and even joy during the midst of suffering. At the same time, we need not only lean into the God of truth, but also lean on the God who cries with us and rages at the enemy of death and disease. We must find that we are not alone and join him in the grief over this terrible time in our friends' and neighbors' and country's life, and perhaps even our own. So you might say, well, Father Jim, isn't this just some kind of pie-in-the-sky wishful thinking that just takes us away from the reality? If you say that, I understand. I get you. And more importantly, so does Jesus. And yet he continues to teach that believing opens up the eyes to seeing things others may not even be able to see. That really shouldn't surprise us. In fact, we're quite familiar with it in other ways. Very great inventions or accomplishments were once a belief before they were that accomplishment. They started in someone's mind before it came to be. If others believed in it too, that wasn't determined by how radical the idea was or how easy it was to believe, but on the credibility and the believability of the one saying it. That's part of what Daniel Burnham counted on when he said, "Make no little plans, for they have no magic to stir men's blood." Burnham had served as the principal architect of the Chicago's World's Fair in 1893. And then he set his sights on a grand vision, Washington's Grand Terminal. It took an army of laborers an entire year and 4 million cubic yards of fill dirt just to fill in the swamp that would become the foundation of Union Station. That's enough dirt to pack 80,000 trains, stretching from 600 miles. 5 years. And $25 million later, Burnham's vision became a reality as Baltimore and Ohio Pittsburgh Express whistled through Union Station at 6:50 a.m. on October 27, 1907. Over the next century, kings and queens would walk through the corridors. During both World Wars, countless servicemen and servicewomen kissed their sweethearts goodbye as they went off to war. And after $160 million restoration in the early 1980s, the modernized metro stop and mall would become the most visited destination in Washington, D.C. You see, great men have always seen beyond what is, in the physical world and in the spiritual world as well. And although we may not be the kind of men and women who have that ability, we can trust those who do. We can trust Jesus. So as Jesus approaches the tomb, the text tells us one other thing that's worth noting. it says that once again he was angry. Some translations say deeply moved. Others have the word troubled. Still others use the term groaning. That's because the actual word is difficult to translate. It's used of animals when they're about to fight, stirred up, and it has the sense that the animal is snorting. It's not quite the image you might normally think of for Jesus, is it? But as he stands at the tomb's entrance, giving orders that it be opened and ignoring the objections that it's been too long and that Lazarus will stink, he's preparing for battle. What's the battle? He's about to fight death itself. We are told in the beginning of the story that the disciples object to him going to see Mary and Martha because they had found respite away from the religious leaders who are trying to arrest him. In fact, it is the raising of Lazarus that sends the authorities over the edge. The very next verses tell us that from then on they hatched a plot to kill him. From that moment, the fight is on. The death bell begins to toll. Lazarus is round one, and it will toll until Easter morning, when Jesus himself emerges from an empty tomb, raised and victorious over death and disease. In this time of Lent, as we approach Easter, let us remember that Easter is not a day on the calendar, but an experience of God's power through truth and tears. And let us wait in confidence to see its dawning, patiently for the God of truth and tears to reveal himself, even in the face of a virus called corona, which means, ironically, the crown. Let us trust him who, in fact, wears the crown. First, the crown of thorns and tears, and finally, the crown of gold in victorious truth. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.